Good evening, Patriots. I'm excited because it's February and February is Black History Month. Some of the Patriots and PJs this month is going to be dedicated to just that, Black history. Do any of you know how Black history got started? Well, let me tell you. Carter Woodson, who was an African-American journalist, author, and historian, he decided in 1915 that it would be important to celebrate the accomplishments of African Americans in our country. So he started Black History Week. And we celebrated Black History Week for many years. And then in 1976, the president decided that we should celebrate Black History Month for an entire month. And we've been celebrating Black History Month ever since. This week, I would like to share with you a story called Sweet Clara and the Freedom Quilt. Clara is a little girl who was a slave on a plantation. And this is all about her story about how she helped get out of slavery and help others get out of slavery. Let me begin. Before I was even 12 years old, I got sent from North Farm to Home Plantation because they needed another field hand. And when I got there, I cried so much. They thought I was never going to eat or drink again. I didn't want to leave my mama. I'm going back to her, I whispered every day to young Jack, who worked beside me in the fields. Well, you better start eating all you can, sweet Clara, he smiled at me. But then his smile was gone. In a low voice, he said, oh, you're not going to make it. Young Jack helped me believe I'd get back to my mama someday. Truth was, I'd be lost before I even got through the fields, them being so big and all. But I didn't give up dreaming. Aunt Rachel was raising me now. She wasn't my for real blood aunt, but she did the best she could to care for me. One night, she come back from working in the big house and she find me lying dead tired on our cabin floor. She shook her head and she said, Sweet Clara, you ain't gonna last in the fields, but I got an idea. Aunt Rachel's idea was sewing, and she started teaching me the very next night. It wasn't easy for me to learn. My hands were already rough and clumsy from hoeing and weeding in the fields, so Aunt Rachel took it real slow. She brought scraps of cloth from the big house and she taught me about each one, how it was special and had to be treated in its own way. I liked to piece the scraps together to make pretty patterns of colors, but Aunt Rachel didn't care much about pretty patterns. Now you rip out that whole row and do it again, Clara, she'd say. Why? Why I gotta keep making the stitches so tiny, I complained. 'Cause you're gonna be a real seamstress. That's why. Do any of you know what a seamstress is? A seamstress is a person that makes clothing or blankets, and they do it by sewing them and making them themselves. So let's see what Clara makes. Tomorrow, you coming with me to the big house. I got it all worked out, Aunt Rachel said one day. I was frightened. You ready to sew with me, she went on. The Mrs. daughter, Ella, she be getting married come spring, and I told Mrs. I was going to need some help. She looked at your work with sharp eyes, Clara, so do it quick and neat, like I taught you. Next morning, I tried to eat some cornbread, but my insides was all knotted up. I'd never been inside the big house before or even seen white people that close, except the overseer. The morning sun was streaming into the sewing room, turning everything all sunflower yellow. Aunt Rachel gave me some sheets to hem. Instead of being contrary, that needle did all I wanted, just like it was part of my hand. At the end of the day, Mrs. come in and said, let me see your work, Clara, she'd say. I gave her the sheet and she ran it through her hands real slow. I held my breath, watching. From now on, I want you to come in here, she said at last. And when she left, Aunt Rachel and I looked at each other, all ready to burst. We done it, girl, she cried. And so now sweet Clara gets to help in the house. So I changed from a field hand to a seamstress. Since the sewing room was right off the kitchen, Aunt Rachel and I were near cook and the helpers. There was always a lot of bustle and company in the kitchen. I was hearing about all kinds of new places and things. In fact, I listened so hard, it felt like my ears must be growing right out of my head and getting big with listening. One day, 2 white men came to see the master. The drivers went into the kitchen to talk to cook. "There's been too many runaways last summer," one of the drivers said. "They going round asking all the masters in the county to join the patty rollers." "Crazy running away," muttered cook as she beat up some batter. "Where are you going to run except get lost in the swamp?" "I don't know," said the other one, "but I hear we ain't that far from the Ohio River. Once you get that far, the Underground Railroad will carry you across." "That's right," agreed the first. "The railroad will get you all the way to Canada, and then you're free forever." Cook snorted. "If it be as easy as you two let on, more would have gone." One of the men replied in a quiet voice, "It'd be easy if we could get a map." Walking back from the big house that evening, I asked Aunt Rachel about what I heard. "Where's Canada? And what's the Underground Railroad?" "See there," Aunt Rachel pointed. "That's the North Star. Under that star, far up north, is Canada. The Underground Railroad is where people been helping folks get there, secret like." She looked at me hard. "But don't you start thinking about it. You run away and get caught, you'll get beaten." Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Next day I asked cook, "Those 2 men that were here yesterday, they was talking about a map." "What's a map?" "It's a picture of the land, that's all. Whatever's on the ground, a map can have it." Sunday I went to my favorite place on the little hill and looked out at the people's cabins and the fields. I took a stick and I started making a picture of things far away that I couldn't see. And how could I make a map that wouldn't be washed up by the rain? How could I make a map that would show all the way to freedom? Then one day, I was sewing a patch on the blue blanket, and the patch looked just the same shape as the cow pond near the cabins. The little stitches looked like the path going all around it. Here it was, a picture that wouldn't wash away. It was a map. So there you have it. I started the quilt. When you sewing, no matter how careful you be, little scraps of cloth always be left after you cut out a dress or a pillowcase. So while my ears kept listening and my hands kept sewing, I began to squirrel away at those bits of cloth. When we was off work, I went to visit people in the quarters, and I started asking what fields were where, and then I started piecing the cloths of fabric together with scraps of things I was learning about. Aunt Rachel say, "Sweet Clara, what kind of pattern are you making in the quilt?" "Ain't no pattern I've ever seen before." "I don't know, Aunt Rachel. I'm just patching it together as I go." She looked at me long, but she nodded. So I think she's starting to make her own map. And I think the aunt knows what she's doing. Let's see. There was buzzing in the quarters one summer evening. I saw the patty rollers and I knew someone had run away. It was young Jack, but 5 days later, they caught him. That next Sunday I went to see him and he walked to the top of the little hill. He didn't smile the way he used to. I took a stick and I began to draw in the dirt. I drew a little square for the big house, a line of boxes for the cabins of the quarters, and some bigger squares for the fields east of the big house. I drew as much as I'd pieced together. Jack sat beside me, not saying anything, not even looking at me at first, and then he started seeing what I was doing. So I handed him the stick. I hear him catch his breath up quick, and then Jack began to draw. I worked on that quilt for a long time. Sometimes months would go by, and I wouldn't get any pieces sewn in it. Sometimes I had to wait to get the right kind of cloth. I had blue calico and flowered blue silk for creeks and rivers, and I had greens and blue greens for fields and white sheeting for roads. Mrs. liked to wear pink a lot, so the big house and the quarters, and finally the big house at the North Farm, they was all pink. The quilt kept getting bigger and bigger, and if folks knew what I was doing, no one said. But they came up by the sewing room to pass the time of day whenever they could. By the way, Clara, a driver might tell me, I heard the master saying yesterday he didn't want to travel to Mr. Morse's place because it's over 20 miles north of here. Or someone would sit eating Cook's food and say, so I could hear, word is they gonna plant corn in 3 west fields on the Venora plantation this year. When the master went out hunting, Cook's husband was the guide. So he would come back and say, that swamp next to the home plantation is a nasty place, but listen up, Clara, and I'll tell you how I thread my way in and out of there as smooth as your needle in that cloth. So they're telling her about the land around where she is so that she can make it in the quilt and add that to the map. Very interesting. Then one night, the quilt was done. I looked at it spread out in the dim light of the cabin. Aunt Rachel studied it for the longest time. She touched the stitches lightly, her fingers moving slowly over the last piece I'd added, a hidden boat that would carry us across the Ohio River. Finally, they came to rest on the bright North Star at the top. She tried to make her voice cheery, and she said, you always did like to make patterns, Clara. You get yourself married to young Jack one of these days, and you two will have a real nice quilt to sleep under. Aunt Rachel, I couldn't sleep under this quilt, I answered, putting my hands over hers. It wouldn't be restful somehow. Anyway, I think it should stay here. Maybe others can use it. Aunt Rachel sighed. But ain't you gonna need the quilt where you going? I kissed her. Don't worry, Aunt Rachel. I got it in the memory of my head. It rained hard for 3 days the next week. Me and Jack, we left the home plantation in a dark thunderstorm. The day after, it was too stormy to work in the fields. So Jack wasn't missed, and Aunt Rachel told them I was sick. We went north following the trail of the Freedom Quilt. All the things that people told me about, all the tiny stitches I took, now I could see the real things. There was the old tree struck down by lightning, the winding road near the creek, the hunting path through the swamp. It was like being in a dream that you have already dreamed. Mostly we hid during the day and walked at night, and we got to the North Farm. Jack slipped in through the darkness to find what cabin my mama was at. Then we went in to get her, and we found a little sister I didn't even know I had. Mama was so surprised. Sweet Clara, you growed so big. Her eyes, just like I remembered. Her arms were strong around me. Mama, I'm here for you. We going north. We know the way. I was afraid they wouldn't come, but then my mama said yes. And young Jack carried my sister Anna, and I held on to Mama's hand. We kept on as fast as we could, skirting farms and towns and making our way through the woods. At last, one clear, dark night, we came to the Ohio River. The river was high, but I remembered the place on the quilt where I'd marked the crossing. We searched the brush along the banks until at last we found the little boat. This was hid here by the folks in the Underground Railroad, I said. The boat carried us across the dark, deep water to the other side. Shivering and hungry and scared, we stood looking ahead. Which way now? Jack asked. I pointed. The North Star was shining clear above us, up there through the woods, north to Canada. Sometimes I think back to the night that we left. When young Jack came to wake me, I can still see Aunt Rachel sitting up in her bed. She just shook her head before I could say a word. Before you go, just cover me with your quilt, sweet Clara, she'd say. I'm too old to walk, but not too old to dream. And maybe I can help others find the quilt to freedom. Aunt Rachel, she kept her word. The quilt is still there at Home Plantation. People go look at it, even folks from neighboring farms. I know because some of them come and they tell me how they used it to get free. But not all are as lucky as we are, and most never can come. Sometimes I wish I could sew a quilt that would spread over the whole land, and the people just following the stitches to freedom as they were taking a Sunday walk. Wow, that's pretty amazing. Sweet Clara was so brave to make the quilt, and I'm so thankful that she was able to get out of slavery, and she was able to help so many other people get out of slavery just as they did in the Underground Railroad. Patriots, I hope you enjoyed learning about this piece of history as much as I enjoyed reading this story with you, and I hope you guys have a great night. Good night, Patriots.